Hey everyone, I'm Kate Kennedy and I'm here with day 27 of 100 Days of Kane, PA. And tonight is Wednesday, so it's a night with the Historic Preservation Society here in Kane. And we typically do this from the depot where the museum is, but you had asked to hear stories about the Thomas L. Kane Memorial Chapel, which is just around the corner here on Chestnut Street. So tonight we're here with Denny Driscoll, who has some fascinating stories to share with you about who Thomas L. Kane was, how the chapel was formed, and the history and design behind it. And there's just so many more stories to be told from here that we'll be doing another part during the 100 days just on the Memorial Chapel to get more stories down the line. But for tonight, that's what we're going to focus on, and I think you're going to be fascinated to learn more about Thomas L. Kane and the Memorial Chapel here on Chestnut Street. So I'm going to go ahead and flip you around, and we're going to show you here. This is what the chapel looks like, as you know. And then we're gonna walk over here and Denny Driscoll is gonna fill us in on the history of this chapel and tell you some great stories. So hi, Mr. Driscoll.
How you doing, Kate?
Good, how are you?
Good, great to see you.
Great to see you. Thank you so much for doing this. It was requested to learn more about the Memorial Chapel, and you're our guy for that. You know a lot of stories.
Oh, very good. Interesting, usually when I stand here, I always ask the person if they've ever been to Salt Lake City. Have you ever been to Salt Lake City?
I have not.
Well, then you've got the perfect answer for me, because I say, good, we just saved you a trip to Salt Lake City, because the statue of our general is identically matched to the one that's in the Capitol building in Salt Lake City.
Wow.
Originally, it was right in the Rotunda. They've since, the last time I was out there, moved it to the North Garden, but it's exactly the same sculpture. And so you don't have to drive all that way to Salt Lake City now. And if you read the messages, it says he was friends of the Mormons, and that he was. And the Mormons dedicated this. But if you read the latest biography on Thomas Kane by Matthew Groh, the subtitle is Liberty to the Downtrodden. And the fascinating thing is that Kane was more than just friends to the Mormons. He was friends to anyone who needed help. He was liberty to the downtrodden. If you were downtrodden, he was a character that would take your part. Actually, he became a colonel simply because he wanted to try to help the Indians after the Trail of Tears. And he wanted to become an Indian agent, so he became a colonel in order to do that. He also was instrumental in developing the Underground Railroad. He was a devout abolitionist, and he actually got in trouble in his father's courtroom in Independence Hall because he had upheld the fugitive slave laws. And his father actually tried most of the cases on the fugitive slave laws. Kane obviously was against that, so he and his father were at odds. During the Civil War, he basically joined the Union Army again to fight slavery. For women, he believed in women's rights, and in fact, he was instrumental in starting a medical college, which Elizabeth went to in the early 1850s. They actually started, he and his brother, an orphanage for the children of unwed mothers. So they were, again, if you were downtrodden, if you needed help, you needed support, Thomas Kane was your person.
Yeah, what a progressive thinker and someone who took action, not just said things or thought things, but really acted on his beliefs.
Yeah, I actually think that Memorial Chapel is past. I think that the living chapel is one could be called the Chapel of Liberty, because this was really his most firm belief, rather than anything beyond that.
And what year was this chapel constructed?
It was constructed when America was a century old. This chapel was brand new.
1876.
Got it. That's what the cornerstone says. Unfortunately, it got buried. Someday, we're going to have to try to dig through our handicap ramp and try to find the original cornerstone. However, it was dedicated in 1887 because it took some years to complete, and then the dedication came a couple years later.
Well, why don't we go inside and you can maybe tell us about how this was designed and who funded it, and we can get more history and stories about the actual creation of the chapel.
Oh, great. Let's go in.
It's such a beautiful building.
Yeah, it was fashioned after after the British churches that he went to in the early 1840s. The only thing is, the British churches had a gray stone, and when you look outside, you can notice a beautiful pink stone, sandstone that we had in our area. Mm-hmm. And so, another thing, the timber framing on the inside, which is where I'm sure he took a lot of that design with the various joints and timber framing from the British churches. They were stuck using oak. And so if you look around, he has an abundance of cherry in here. So here we are in the black cherry capital of the world, and he really was pushed into using cherry for this.
That's beautiful, yeah. My squeaky shoes.
Yeah, the timber frame is something else. Well, actually, the dream of this church came way back when Thomas was between the ages of 19 and 21. Either sometime within the time between 1841 and 1843. He was in England, and he was in a British church like this in England that Charles Dickens went to, and it was historically notable, the timber framing and so forth that the British used. And so Thomas did a sketch way back then. He did a drawing, which we haven't been able to locate, and we've been checking with Brigham Young University, and that's really, that'll be a golden find once we locate that sketch, if it's available. But his dream started way back when.
What year would that have been?
That would have been 1841 to 1843. I believe he probably did a sketch in 1843 when he was 21. Wow. But he could have started it as a teenager when he was 19. Actually, his 200th birthday is coming up in 2022, because he's born in 1822.
Wow.
So he did the sketch, and he kept it in his pocket all those years until all of a sudden his mills burnt down. One of his mills had burnt down in the early 1870s, and there was a severe depression in America in 1873, where money was worth something like 15 cents on the dollar. And his mill had burnt down, and he had an aunt. Her name was Anne Gray Leeper Thomas, and it was his mother's youngest sister. And she called Thomas her favorite nephew, and so she wanted to give him the money to rebuild his mill that had just burnt down.
Where was the mill located?
The sawmill was over by where the B&O railroad station is, where Cane Handle is today, or was. And so it's sort of the beginning of the trail for the rails to trails that's coming along. And so it has a great spot in the future, and it was there in the past. We have some old photographs of that. However, when it was gone, his aunt wanted him to be able to continue building his community. And so she wanted to rebuild the mill. And he refused. He didn't want the money to rebuild the mill, and he refused for a couple of years. And finally he said, I'll tell you what you can build. Instead of building a mill, we'll build a memorial, we'll build a chapel to your family. And right next to us, we have the granite story. It is cut in stone. And this is the story of how this came about. I think it tells us something important about Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine understood that most things were financial, were always rising and falling, were always up and down. Whether it was a timber industry, whether it was the oil industry, whether it was the bituminous, there was a rise and fall. And so instead of investing in economic wealth, he decided the best thing was to invest in spiritual wealth. And so he dreamed up this chapel as a memorial to her family from the sketch that he had back in his pocket from the 1840s. And I'm sure he pulled it out. It was pretty well wrinkled, but he still had those ideas and still had that vision for this building. The interesting thing is that sketch came from England in 1843. He was there during the Christmas of 1843 when he took a doll from Paris, purchased a doll for his little cousin Elizabeth, who was 7 years old in 1843. He was 21. He gave her this doll for Christmas, and it was exactly the same Christmas that Charles Dickens completed his famous story, The Christmas Carol, in England. So it's very possible he did the sketch in the same one of the same churches that Charles Dickens went to in England, and the same year as The Christmas Carol. Later on, Charles Dickens did read some of Thomas Paine's work.
Wow.
And he actually read the account of the Mormons' migration west, which Thomas Paine wrote, and he mentions Thomas L. Paine's name in a couple of places in his travel log in the late 1860s.
Wow, I had no idea there was a connection between Charles Dickens and Thomas L. Paine.
Yeah.
That's neat.
Yeah, and even with this building, the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that he got inspired by a church in England that Charles Dickens would have attended.
Yeah, and it's our blessing to have so much cherry, and
yeah, it's beautiful.
And they blended it that way, and the pink sandstone. Now the slab, whereas the memorial.
That's slang
the
for
memorial carving has the dedication on it. And it's interesting. It's been here for ever since it was built, and very few people ever read and ever understood what all these names were. Erected by Anne Gray Thomas. Her name was Anne Gray Leeper Thomas. And in fact, just got a call yesterday from someone who has a painting that was done by Thomas Sully. In fact, two paintings, Anne Gray Leeper Thomas and her husband, Thomas, Mr. Thomas, and they were done by a famous painter by the name of Thomas Sully. Probably the premier portrait painter of the American scene in the mid-1800s, or in the early 1800s, because he is a painting of George Washington. He did a painting of George Washington crossing in Delaware, painted just about every notable figure in American history. And he did one better than Gilbert Stuart, whose image is on the dollar bill. You'll recognize that of George Washington. But the interesting thing is Gilbert Stuart never did Queen Victoria, but Thomas Sully did a painting of Queen Victoria.
So the same
as
painter
well.
who painted portraits of Queen Victoria, who painted portraits of George Washington, painted a portrait of Thomas L. Paine's aunt and uncle.
Yes, and we're going to be able to have them in the chapel for the first time, an image of Anne Gray Thomas,
Wow.
which is really pretty exciting. And
Very
they're,
exciting.
they're
That just
quite
happened-
valuable.
You just received this news when?
Yesterday.
Very exciting.
Yeah, I knew that the gentleman was thinking about donating them, and Wade, I think we probably won out over the Smithsonian, as a matter of fact.
That's amazing.
But Anne Gray Thomas was his mother's younger sister. Now, on this marker, it's in memory of her father, and that was his mother's father, Thomas Leeper. Now, that sounds familiar to you. Thomas Leeper Kane was named after his maternal grandfather, Thomas Leeper. And Thomas Leeper was a pretty important person in Philadelphia. He's a wealthy property owner during the American Revolution. And we have a couple of chairs that came from a house he rented to his friend in Virginia, Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson, there's one of the chairs over there. And Thomas Jefferson.
The one with the
Yes, the one with the ribbon on it. And we actually have two of those. We have one at the Pennsylvania Railroad Station as well.
Wow.
So we have the other one right up the street at the station. Anyway, that gets into a whole other realm of history, which we won't go into, but Thomas Leeper was instrumental in the American Revolution, and most people aren't aware of that. He was instrumental before the American Revolution, and her mother, Elizabeth Coldus Gray. Elizabeth Gray was Thomas's mother's mother, his maternal grandmother. Now, the interesting thing about her is that she was 13 years old when she was at the reception at Gray's Ferry Inn, which her parents owned, which was held in honor of George Washington in 1775, who was just appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army.
Oh my goodness.
Ben Franklin was there, John Adams, etc. All the people who signed the Declaration of Independence a year before they signed the Declaration of Independence.
So our founder, Thomas L. Kane, his grandmother was at a reception where the people who signed the Declaration of Independence were gathered the year before it was signed.
Yes.
Wow.
And many times after that, because Gray's Ferry Inn was actually the first resort in America. And the tea set we have at the station also was at Gray's Ferry Inn.
Wow.
And so that came from there. Served many, many people, important people through history. That takes us away a little bit from this. And so then it takes us, so it's dedicated to Thomas Leeper, Elizabeth Coldus Gray, and their children. Now there are 10 children here listed here. And so it has all the children. You can see they were all Leepers, George Gray Leeper and so forth, all their names. And we come down to Jane Duval Kane. This is really the only Kane that's on this memorial plaque. And Thomas Kane's name's not on here, so people didn't realize what important effect he had in this whole building. Really, it was his wish that this be built without his name on it, because this was the only Kane on there. Here's Anne Gray Leeper Thomas, who put up the funds supposedly to do this, which is pretty interesting. Then it comes all the way down to Samuel McKean Leeper. And Samuel McKean Leeper is really kind of responsible for us being on the big level to begin with, because he bought a major acreage. It was 125,000 acres, between 124 and 125,000 acres in the early 1850s. And then he died maybe a little more than a year after that. We now know it as the Big Level. But his wife in Philadelphia, had no idea where the Big Level was. In fact, she said, well, I own what? Where? And so, Jane Duval Kane, being the kind stepsister, being the kind sister-in-law that she was, went to her husband, John Kane, Thomas Leeper Kane's father, and said, gee, will you help her out? What are we going to do with this property? And so that's how the McKean and Elk Land and Improvement Company got started. And Thomas came up here as an agent, and that's sort of the whole story of why we're all here right now and how we got here.
He came up to check out the land that was left by his uncle when he died,
Right.
and fell in love with Cain.
Yep.
Well, what is now known as Cain.
And we're yeah.
Wow, what a great, you're right, this tells a story. This plaque tells a story of how this all came to be. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and the amazing thing is that we live in a time of miracles when you couldn't, to dig up all the information on this was really quite a challenge to start piecing it together. The Mormons had been here for over 25 years, and even when we came and explained this marker to her, and she said, well, it was like the first time she had ever walked into the building. Because it didn't know what was behind the whole thing.
Right, so, okay, so let me recap here, make sure I have this straight. So we have the Thomas Kane's sawmill burns down, or mill burns down. His aunt, Anne Gray Thomas, wants to pay to have it rebuilt. He says, no, why don't you build a chapel instead? And he pulls out the plans that he's been dreaming of since he was 19, 20, or 21 years old, and has this built with his aunt's money. What was it initially used for? When it was first built, what type of chapel was this?
It was what was dedicated as a Presbyterian church. He built it as more or less a gift to Elizabeth. Because Elizabeth wanted to have a meaningful Presbyterian church here. And Thomas, above all, believed in not being a Mormon, not being quite so much an organized religion person, but believed in the propensity and the depth of love within the human spirit. And you can see that in the rose windows. The east window.
This one up here, the circle one?
That's the west window.
Oh.
And the west window, we'll go with the west window. The west window is faith, hope, and charity. And on this, charity is first of all, is the charities most of all, but actually charity had another word, which was love. And it was actually interposable. And in fact, if you see the heart shape down at the bottom of the window, just as below the cross, that was representative of the concept of charity or of love.
That's beautiful.
The front window, or the east window, that the sun first hits, was their lily window, and that was their favorite Bible verse, that even the lilies of the field, and were taken care of. No matter what happened, they knew that the spirit of goodness and love in the universe would protect and provide for them. And they had faith in that. And that became a dominant symbol for them.
So it was built originally as a Presbyterian church. Can you kind of give us a brief overview of what it was used for over the years then? Because that was a long time ago.
Well, yes. Well, it eventually, originally, it was used again by the Presbyterians up until about 1970.
Oh, so from 1876, 77 through 1970, it was used as a Presbyterian church.
Yes, so it was not quite 100 years, but it was, and actually it was dedicated in 1878. And so from that time to 1970, the church was moving over to Grieve Street, and it was unknown what was going to happen. And the Mormons don't usually buy old churches. They build new buildings. But again, the message of love went out to them that Thomas Leeper Kane was so important to their existence in Salt Lake City, their continuation as a community of believing people, that they came and purchased this building. And they took care of it. They redid, put a new roof on it, brought it back into great condition. And then it was, I believe, around 2012, 2013, that the gas line, for some reason, where the heat was shut off in here, and it flooded. And most of the building deteriorated. And the Mormons came back in and restored it back to really pristine condition. And we had then, at the Preservation Society, volunteered to more or less be caretakers of this building.
Because they were caring from Salt Lake City, right? The
Right.
Mormons
Well,
weren't living here
they
in
had
Maine.
somebody that came in, but they would come in periodically, and
Okay.
you can't. You just can't leave a building in Kane in October and then come
Right.
back and check it in March. And then that's I don't know what the time frame was, but that's when the damage was done. And so we felt that we could just come in and check on it on a weekly basis. And they thought that was a good idea. But I really felt, we all felt that it was time for someone in the community to take responsibility for this precious monument to our history. This building, along with the railroad station, along with our railroad station, are the only two buildings that we can guarantee that Thomas and Elizabeth were in together. And in that, they have immense historic importance to the continuation of the dream they had and the dream we all have of living in a community of sharing good things together.
So then you took it over.
And they were going to lease it to us first. We thought, oh, well, that would be a good idea, because anyway, there was a lot of upkeep and so forth. Just the utilities and so forth, the building and so forth. It's an expense, and so they thought more of it, and they said, well, we kind of like to turn it over to your Preservation Society. And we knew that it would be a challenge, but we knew that it was a loving choice that they made, and we felt we had to make the loving choice and take responsibility for it. And so we did. And it's, as you can imagine, it's a few $1,000s a month that need to be devoted to the building, but it's
So worth
the
it.
building's priceless.
Yes, it really
It
is.
is absolutely priceless.
And you did such a great job sharing the beginnings of the stories of the beginnings of this building. It just is so inspiring to think about who all has been through here and how it came to be and how it was designed, and what an awesome story.
Well, we're only reflecting the incredible character of the people who left us all these gifts.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up for the night?
Well, thank you for listening and come in. The beautiful thing is now this belongs to absolutely everybody. We've had weddings here. We've had band concerts here. We've had classical music here. We've had rock music here. We've had appointments to West Point here. Just any good, loving reason that somebody wants to share, this building is available for them.
So if someone would be interested in utilizing this building, they would just reach out to the Kane Historic Preservation Society. to schedule that?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, and we'll definitely be back with you again in a future week to learn more about this chapel, because I think we just scratched the surface.
We haven't. Thank you, Kate.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right, everyone, I hope that you feel as inspired as I do after learning more of the stories of how this chapel came to be. I learned so much tonight, and I'm so just grateful to live in a place where our founder was such a loving man who really was devoted to speaking up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. And so, yes, it was just awesome to hear and learn, and we'll definitely be back in the future to hear more stories of the chapel specifically. But you guys have requested some other stories to be shared as well, and I just want to continue to put that call out to you. What are some stories of Cain's history that you want to hear? It can be from any decade, about any topic. We would love to hear from you about what stories you want to learn about on these upcoming Wednesday nights during the 100 Days of Cain. So please comment below with your suggestions, and we'll do our best to accommodate your requests. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you again tomorrow for day 28.